His father gave him to a poor maid as punishment, but the virgin billionaire never expected her touch too. A cold, distant billionaire thinks he can treat people however he wants, until the night his own father hands him over to a poor maid he insulted. As punishment, forced into her small world, he expects misery. But the first time she reaches out to help him, something impossible happens. His years of hidden pain vanish at her touch, and that's when he realizes this quiet woman carries something he can't explain, something gentle, powerful, and maybe even dangerous if the wrong people find out. But when a sudden scandal puts her life in the spotlight, everything spirals out of control. He's faced with a choice that could destroy his family, or save the only person who ever showed him real kindness. What happens when the truth behind her touch threatens to tear both their lives apart? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The grand ballroom of the Carr mansion sparkled under crystal chandeliers, their light reflecting off polished marble floors and gilded mirrors. Servers in crisp black uniforms moved efficiently between elegant tables draped in white linen, where Silicon Valley's elite gathered for the annual Carr Foundation Charity Gala. Julian Carr stood near the main table, his tailored tuxedo doing little to ease the tension in his shoulders. The morning's contentious board meeting had left him with a splitting headache, and the familiar burning sensation crawled down his arms like fire beneath his skin. He clenched his jaw, fighting to maintain his composed exterior while the nerve pain intensified. "If I could just have everyone's attention," the event coordinator announced. "Dinner will be served shortly." Julian checked his watch. Another 2 hours of this circus to endure. He pulled out his chair, the movement sending a fresh wave of pain through his forearms. The medication he'd taken earlier wasn't touching it tonight. That's when it happened. A gentle bump against his chair sent him stumbling forward slightly, and something in Julian snapped. He whirled around to face the source of the disruption. A young black woman in a maid's uniform, water pitcher in hand, her eyes already wide with apology. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Carr," she said softly, taking a step back. "I didn't mean to. Are you blind?" Julian's voice cut through the murmur of conversation like a knife. The room fell silent as heads turned toward the commotion. Or just incompetent. The maid, Evelyn Brooks, according to her name tag, stood perfectly still, her hands steady on the pitcher despite Julian's mounting tirade. "Sir, I apologize. Do you have any idea what this suit costs?" Julian continued, his voice rising. "More than you'll make in a year. Though given your apparent lack of basic motor skills, I'm shocked you're employed at all." Evelyn's face remained composed, though something flickered in her eyes. Not fear, but a deep sadness that only fueled Julian's anger. The pain in his arms throbbed in time with his pulse as he watched several guests pull out their phones, no doubt capturing his outburst. "Mr. Carr," Evelyn said quietly, "I understand you're upset. Would you like me to have someone else serve your table?" "I'd like you to do your job without creating a spectacle," he snapped, "though clearly that's beyond your capabilities." A few uncomfortable coughs echoed through the ballroom. Julian caught sight of his father Edward's face across the room, a mask of cold disappointment that made his stomach twist. But the pain and frustration overwhelmed any sense of shame, and he turned back to Evelyn with a dismissive wave. "Just get out of my sight before you cause any more damage." Evelyn gave a small nod and walked away, her steps measured and dignified, despite the public humiliation. The usual buzz of conversation slowly resumed, though Julian could feel the weight of disapproving stares from every direction. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and awkward small talk. Julian's phone buzzed constantly with notifications as clips of his outbursts spread across social media. By the time the last guests departed, his head was pounding, and his arms felt like they were being squeezed in a vice. He marched straight to his father's study, expecting to find an ally in his frustration. The room was exactly as it had been since Julian's childhood. Walls lined with leather-bound books, the massive mahogany desk dominating the space, and his mother's portrait watching over it all with gentle eyes that seemed to pierce right through him. Edward Carr sat in his high-backed chair, his tablet displaying one of the viral videos of Julian's tirade. He didn't look up when Julian entered. "Father, you won't believe the incompetence I had to deal with tonight. That made—" Silence. Edward's voice was quiet but carried the weight of steel. He finally raised his eyes to meet Julian's, and the fury there made Julian take a step back. "You have disgraced everything your mother and I built." "What, that woman—" "That woman," Edward cut in, "has worked here for 3 years without a single complaint. She tends to our elderly staff members when they're ill. She volunteers at the hospital on her days off, and you just humiliated her in front of 200 people because you were in pain and too proud to admit it." Julian's mouth went dry. "How did you—" "I'm your father, Julian. I know when you're hurting. I also know your mother would be heartbroken to see what you've become." Edward stood, his expression hardening. "So I'm going to do what I should have done years ago." "What are you talking about?" "Pack your things. You'll be moving to the servant wing tonight." Julian laughed, but the sound died in his throat when he saw his father's unwavering stare. "You can't be serious." "You will be given to the maid you mocked." Edward continued. "You'll live under her supervision until she decides you've learned the lessons your mother and I clearly failed to teach you." "This is ridiculous. I'm the CEO of—" "You're my son!" Edward thundered. "And you've forgotten what that means. Your position, your wealth, none of it matters if you've lost your humanity." He walked around the desk until he stood face to face with Julian. "A small room has been prepared. You'll report there immediately." Julian stared at his father, searching for any sign of uncertainty, but found none. The portrait of his mother seemed to watch the exchange with sad eyes, and for a moment he felt like a small boy again, caught in some thoughtless act of cruelty. "You can't do this," he whispered. "I already have." Edward turned back to his desk. "Pack light. You won't need much where you're going." Julian stood frozen, his carefully controlled world crumbling around him as the weight of his father's words sank in. The nerve pain in his arms seemed to pulse in time with his racing heart, a physical reminder of the weakness he'd tried so hard to hide. Now that weakness would be on display for everyone to see, especially the woman he'd just publicly humiliated. The room that had always been his sanctuary suddenly felt suffocating. His father's disappointment, his mother's portrait, and the knowledge of what awaited him in the servant wing all pressed in on him like a physical weight. For the first time in years, Julian Carr found himself completely powerless, and the realization left him speechless. The first rays of sunlight crept through the small window of Julian's servant quarters, casting unfamiliar shadows across the narrow bed. He blinked awake, momentarily confused by the scratchy sheets and the distant sound of vacuum cleaners humming through thin walls. This wasn't his memory foam mattress or his penthouse suite with its floor-to-ceiling windows. This was his punishment. Julian groaned and pressed his palms against his eyes. The nerve pain in his arms had started early today, a dull throb that promised to grow worse as the hours passed. Through the walls he could hear the clattering of dishes and muffled voices, the morning routine of a world he'd never bothered to notice before. A soft knock at the door made him sit up too quickly. "Yes?" he called out, hating how uncertain his voice sounded. "Mr. Carr." Evelyn's voice was calm and professional, betraying none of the tension from their encounter the previous night. "Breakfast is served in the staff kitchen until 8 o'clock. You're expected to report there afterward for your assignments." Julian glanced at the basic digital clock on the nightstand. 7:15. "Fine," he muttered, loud enough to be heard through the door. He waited for a response, but Evelyn's footsteps were already retreating down the hall. The shared bathroom at the end of the corridor was mercifully empty when Julian ventured out. He stared at his reflection in the spotted mirror, noting how out of place his designer pajamas looked in the utilitarian space. His father hadn't given him time to pack properly. Just enough for a few days, he'd assumed. Now he wasn't so sure. The staff kitchen was a stark contrast to the formal dining room where Julian usually took his meals. It was small but efficient, with well-worn countertops and a round table where several staff members were eating breakfast. Their conversations died down when he entered, replaced by pointed looks and whispers. Julian grabbed a bowl of oatmeal and an apple, settling at the far end of the table. The food was plain but hot, nothing like his usual protein smoothie and artisanal coffee. He ate quickly, keeping his eyes down, trying to ignore the stares of the other staff members. At 8 o'clock sharp, Evelyn appeared in the doorway. She wore a simple black dress with a white apron, her hair neatly pulled back. "Mr. Carr, if you're finished, we'll begin with the morning cleaning routine." Julian followed her through the service corridors, his arms already aching. They stopped at a large linen closet where Evelyn demonstrated the proper way to fold sheets and towels. "Each fold must be precise," she explained, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. "The guests expect perfection." Julian's first attempts were clumsy, the corners uneven, the folds sloppy. Evelyn corrected him patiently, though he could sense her restraint. The woman he'd humiliated was now teaching him the most basic of tasks, and they both knew it. After an hour of struggling with linens, Evelyn handed him a broom. "The East Wing corridors need sweeping," she said. "Start from the far end and work your way back. Be thorough." The simple task proved surprisingly challenging. Julian's arms protested with each movement, the pain growing sharper. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he awkwardly pushed the broom across the wooden floors. Other staff members passed by occasionally, some hiding smirks, others openly staring at the spectacle of Julian Carr, CEO, doing menial labor. By midday, the pain had become unbearable. Julian was near the laundry room when his arms seized up completely. The broom clattered to the floor as he stumbled, his vision blurring at the edges. He braced himself against the wall, breathing heavily, trying to maintain his composure. Footsteps approached quickly, and then Evelyn was there, her face etched with concern despite everything. "Mr. Carr, are you all right?" "I'm fine," he gasped, but his legs were giving out. He slid down the wall, clutching his arms to his chest. Without hesitation, Evelyn knelt beside him. "Let me help," she said softly, reaching for his arm. Julian wanted to pull away, to reject her help, but the pain was too intense. Her hand gently wrapped around his forearm, and then something extraordinary happened. The pain vanished. Not gradually, not partially, but completely, as if it had never existed. Julian froze, staring at where her dark hand contrasted against his pale skin. In all the years he'd suffered from this condition, nothing had provided such immediate relief. Not the expensive medications, not the physical therapy, not even the experimental treatments he'd tried in secret. Evelyn seemed equally shocked. She quickly withdrew her hand, and the pain began to creep back, though not as severely as before. "I'm sorry," she said, standing up and smoothing her apron. "I didn't mean to. I should go check on the laundry." She hurried into the nearby room, leaving Julian still sitting on the floor, stunned by what had just occurred. The rest of the day passed in a blur of confused thoughts and half-hearted attempts at work. When evening finally came, Julian lay on his narrow cot, staring at the water-stained ceiling. The same questions kept circling in his mind. What had happened in that hallway? How had Evelyn done what teams of specialists couldn't? What kind of woman was she, really? He lifted his arm in the dim light, examining the spot where she had touched him. The pain was there again, constant and familiar, but the memory of its sudden absence lingered. Julian had built his life on things he could control, could understand. But now, in this small room so far from his normal world, he found himself facing something he couldn't explain. The sounds of the mansion's nighttime routine drifted through the walls. Distant footsteps, the hum of the industrial dishwasher, muffled conversations he couldn't quite make out. Julian continued to stare at the ceiling, his mind returning again and again to that moment in the hallway, to the mysterious woman who had been given authority over him, and to the unsettling realization that perhaps he didn't understand as much about the world as he'd thought. Dawn crept through the small window of Julian's servant quarters, finding him already awake. He hadn't slept much, his mind replaying yesterday's inexplicable moment with Evelyn over and over. The pain in his arms had returned to its usual dull throb, but the memory of its complete absence haunted him. He dressed in the simple clothes that had replaced his designer suits and made his way to the staff dining area. The smell of coffee and toast guided him through the narrow corridors. When he reached the doorway, he paused, watching Evelyn work quietly in the small kitchen space. She moved with practiced efficiency, preparing what looked like enough breakfast for the entire staff. Her hands worked steadily as she cracked eggs into a large bowl, her face peaceful in concentration. Without her noticing him, Julian stepped into the room. "Can I help?" The words felt foreign in his mouth. When was the last time he'd offered to help anyone with anything? Evelyn startled slightly, then composed herself. "Good morning, Mr. Carr," she said, her voice measured. "If you'd like to help, you can start by setting the table." Julian nodded, grateful for the simple task. As he began placing plates and utensils, he kept stealing glances at Evelyn, wondering how to broach the subject of yesterday's strange occurrence. But before he could find the words, she spoke. "Mr. Carr," she began, her voice soft but steady. "I think we need to talk about what happened at the gala." Julian's hands froze mid-motion. He'd expected her to mention the healing touch, not this. That's not necessary," he muttered. "With respect, sir, it is." Evelyn turned to face him fully, her dark eyes holding his gaze. "What you did that night, how you spoke to me, it wasn't just about me. It was about dignity. Every person who works in this house, who serves at your events, they're people with lives, families, dreams. When you humiliate one of us, you wound all of us." Her words carried no anger, only a gentle firmness that somehow cut deeper than any angry confrontation could have. Julian found himself unable to look away as she continued. "Your mother understood this," Evelyn said softly. "From what I've heard, she treated everyone here like family." The mention of his mother sent an uncomfortable pang through Julian's chest. He turned away, busying himself with straightening already perfect place settings. As the morning progressed, more staff members filtered in for breakfast. Among them were two elderly workers Julian vaguely recognized, Mrs. Laverne Thompson and Mr. Harwood. They greeted Evelyn warmly, then gave Julian measured looks. "Well, well," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice rich with years of wisdom. "Look who's joining us for breakfast." She settled into a chair, her eyes twinkling. "You know, I remember when you were just a little boy, running through these same halls." Mr. Harwood nodded, pulling out a chair for himself. "Your mother used to bring you down here all the time. She'd have coffee with us, ask about our families." He chuckled softly, She never let anyone eat alone. Julian sat stiffly, uncomfortable with these memories he'd tried so hard to forget. Mrs. Thompson reached across the table and patted his hand, surprising him with her boldness. "Your mama," she said. She had such a beautiful heart. Every Christmas, she'd make sure all our grandchildren had presents. When my Tommy was sick, she visited him in the hospital. Mrs. Thompson's eyes grew misty. She understood that wealth wasn't just about money. It was about using what you have to lift others up. Julian's throat tightened. He remembered those hospital visits, how his mother would insist on going even when she was tired from her own health struggles. He'd been so young then, watching her demonstrate a kind of strength that had nothing to do with power or control. Throughout the day, as Julian worked alongside Evelyn and the others, more stories of his mother emerged. Mr. Harwood recalled how she'd helped put his daughter through college. Mrs. Thompson spoke of countless moments of kindness, small gestures that had meant everything to the people who received them. Each story felt like a gentle rebuke, highlighting how far Julian had strayed from his mother's example. The mansion's grandeur, which had always seemed like his birthright, now felt hollow in comparison to the rich tapestry of human connections his mother had woven. As evening approached, the staff gathered for their evening meal. Julian hung back uncertainly, but Evelyn gestured to an empty chair. "Join us?" she said simply. The table was nothing like the formal dining room upstairs. Here, dishes were passed hand to hand, conversations flowed freely, and laughter punctuated the meal. Julian sat quietly, taking it all in. The food was simple: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans. But somehow it tasted better than any gourmet meal he'd had recently. He watched as Mrs. Thompson teased Mr. Harwood about his garden, as Evelyn shared a story about her nephew's school play, as people who worked long hours still found energy to care about each other's lives. For the first time, he saw them not as servants, but as a community, one his mother had been part of, and one he had chosen to ignore. The weight of his own arrogance settled heavily on his shoulders as he sat among them, included despite everything. His mother's absence felt especially acute in this moment, and he wondered what she would think of the man he'd become. The humble meal became a profound lesson in everything he'd forgotten about true wealth and dignity. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the mansion, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Julian found himself following Evelyn into the library, a feather duster in his inexperienced hands. The vast room, with its floor-to-ceiling shelves and leather-bound volumes, had always been more of a showpiece than a sanctuary for him. But now, working alongside Evelyn, he noticed details he'd overlooked before: the gentle creak of old wood, the musty sweetness of aged paper, the way dust motes danced in the sunbeams. As they worked in companionable silence, Julian couldn't help but study her calm demeanor. Every movement seemed purposeful, graceful even, as she carefully tended to each shelf. Her composure struck him as remarkable, especially given how he'd treated her at the gala. "How do you do it?" he finally asked, breaking the quiet. "Stay so composed, I mean, even after everything that happened." Evelyn paused, her hand resting on an old encyclopedia. For a moment, she seemed to be weighing her words carefully. "It wasn't always this way," she admitted softly. "There was a time when I could barely leave my house." Julian stopped dusting, surprised by her candor. Evelyn moved to a nearby armchair, settling into it as if the weight of memories demanded a moment's rest. He found himself pulling up another chair, the feather duster forgotten in his lap. "When I was 11, she began, her voice steady but gentle. "Something happened that changed everything. My father and I were caught in a store robbery. He She paused, drawing a deep breath. He didn't make it. For years after that, I could barely function. Panic attacks would hit me out of nowhere. In stores, at school, even at home. The simplest things could trigger them. Julian leaned forward, struck by the contrast between the composed woman before him and the frightened child she described. What changed? A small smile touched Evelyn's lips. My grandmother. She was like an anchor when everything else felt unstable. She'd sit with me during the attacks, just holding my hand and praying. She never rushed me or told me to get over it. She just stayed. She gestured to the library around them. Books helped too. I'd hide in the library at school during lunch, finding comfort in stories about people who faced impossible things and survived. My church community rallied around us. They brought meals, offered rides to therapy appointments, included us in everything even when I could barely participate. Therapy? Julian asked, surprised to hear her mention it so openly. Evelyn nodded. Every Tuesday and Thursday for 3 years. My grandmother worked extra shifts to pay for it. The therapist helped me understand that my reactions were normal responses to trauma, not weakness. She taught me breathing techniques, grounding exercises. But most importantly, she helped me see that while I couldn't control what had happened, I could choose how to move forward. Julian found himself thinking about his own ways of dealing with pain, both physical and emotional. His tendency to lash out, to keep people at arm's length, suddenly seemed like a poor defense mechanism. Faith played a huge part too. Evelyn continued, not in a magical pray and everything gets better way, but in helping me understand that my worth wasn't determined by what happened to me or how others treated me. It gave me a foundation when everything else felt shaky. As she spoke, Julian noticed how her hands moved expressively, how her eyes held both sadness and strength. This woman, whom he'd dismissed as just another servant, had depths he'd never imagined. The morning light had shifted to afternoon when they finally resumed their dusting. They worked their way through the library, with Evelyn occasionally sharing more snippets of her journey. The first time she managed to go shopping again, her graduation day, the moment she realized she could help others who were hurting. Later, in the silver room, Julian struggled with the intricate process of polishing the family's antique silverware. His fingers, more accustomed to signing documents than handling delicate cleaning tools, fumbled with the tarnished pieces. Here, Evelyn said, moving beside him. Let me show you. She demonstrated the proper technique, explaining each step with the same patience she'd shown while sharing her story. You want to move in small circles, gentle but firm. See? Julian watched her hands, noting how she treated each piece with respect, as if the simple act of cleaning held dignity. He tried to mimic her movements, his usual frustration with imperfection tempered by her encouraging presence. Better, she said when he managed to restore some shine to a silver spoon. It takes practice, like most worthwhile things. The afternoon passed in a rhythm of polish and shine, gentle instruction and careful effort. As the sun began its descent, casting orange light through the windows, Julian realized he felt different. The constant tension in his shoulders had eased. His breathing seemed deeper, more natural. They walked back to the servant wing together, their footsteps echoing in the corridor. The setting sun painted the walls in warm hues, and Julian found himself walking more slowly, not quite ready for the day to end. At her door, Evelyn paused. "Good night, Mr. Carr," she said softly. "Julian," he corrected, surprising himself. "Please, call me Julian." She nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "Good night, Julian." As he continued to his own room, Julian felt something unfamiliar settling in his chest, a kind of peace he hadn't known he was missing. The woman he'd once dismissed had shown him strength of a different kind, one that had nothing to do with power or control. As he prepared for bed, he found himself thinking about her story, about resilience and grace, and about the unexpected ways healing could begin. The insistent pounding jolted Julian from sleep. His small servant quarters room was still dark, the window showing only the faintest hint of pre-dawn light. Someone was banging urgently on his door. "Mr. Carr, please wake up!" The voice belonged to Mrs. Thompson, the elderly housekeeper. Her usual calm demeanor was replaced by clear panic. Julian stumbled to the door, his heart racing. "What's wrong?" "It's your father, sir. He's collapsed. The ambulance is on its way." Mrs. Thompson's face was pale in the dim hallway light. "They found him unconscious in his study." The words hit Julian like a physical blow. He grabbed his jacket, not bothering to change out of his sleep clothes. As he rushed down the hall, another door opened. Evelyn emerged, already dressed in simple clothes, her face etched with concern. "I'll come with you," she said quietly. There was no discussion needed. In that moment, their unusual arrangement seemed irrelevant. They hurried through the mansion's corridors, their footsteps echoing in the pre-dawn silence. Outside, James, their long-time driver, had already brought the car around. Red and blue lights flashed at the main entrance as paramedics loaded Edward onto a stretcher. Julian's throat tightened as he saw his father's still form. Edward's face was ashen, his usually commanding presence diminished. The paramedics worked quickly, attaching monitors and speaking in clipped, professional tones. "We'll follow the ambulance," James said, opening the car door. Julian nodded numbly, sliding into the back seat beside Evelyn. Her presence was steady, grounding, though she remained silent. The drive to the hospital seemed endless. Julian stared out the window, his mind racing. He'd argued with his father just yesterday about the company's direction. Now those disagreements seemed trivial, meaningless. Evelyn's hand rested near his on the seat between them. He noticed how she occasionally glanced his way, her expression full of compassion. The same hands that had eased his own pain just days ago. Could they possibly? He pushed the thought away, focusing on the ambulance's flashing lights ahead. At the hospital, they were directed to a private waiting room while doctors examined Edward. Hours crawled by. Julian paced restlessly while Evelyn sat quietly, her hands clasped in her lap. Around mid-morning, a doctor finally approached. "Mr. Carr?" The doctor's expression was carefully neutral. "Your father's condition is puzzling us. He's experiencing severe nerve complications along with cardiac irregularities. We're running tests, but we haven't identified the cause yet." Julian felt his world tilting. "What do you mean, you don't know?" He's never had heart problems before. "Sometimes these things can develop suddenly. We're doing everything we can, but his vital signs are unstable." The doctor paused. "You might want to prepare yourself." The words hung in the air like a physical threat. Julian sank into a chair, his legs suddenly unable to support him. He looked at Evelyn, who had remained a silent presence throughout the morning. Her eyes met his, and he saw understanding dawn in them even before he spoke. "Evelyn," he whispered, "please, I know it's asking a lot, but—" He glanced around to ensure they were alone. "What you did for me, could you try with him?" She paled visibly, her hands beginning to tremble. "Julian, I can't. If anyone saw—" "I'll protect you," he promised fiercely. "Whatever happens, I'll make sure you're safe. But please, he's my father." Evelyn closed her eyes, taking several deep breaths. When she opened them, determination had replaced fear. "We'll need a moment alone with him." They waited until the nurse finished her rounds, then slipped into Edward's private room. The steady beep of monitors filled the space. Edward lay still, tubes and wires connecting him to various machines. His skin had a greyish tinge that terrified Julian. Evelyn approached the bed slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. She glanced at Julian once more, then gently placed her hand on Edward's forearm, just below where the IV entered his skin. For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Then, gradually, the erratic beeping of the heart monitor steadied. Colour began returning to Edward's face. His breathing, which had been shallow and laboured, deepened and evened out. A nurse rushed in, drawn by the changing monitor readings. "What's happening?" she asked, staring at the displays in shock. Evelyn yanked her hand away as if burned, stepping back from the bed. "I was just checking on him," she stammered. The nurse hurried to examine Edward, her expression bewildered. "His readings are stabilizing. I'll get the doctor." As soon as she left, Evelyn backed towards the door. "No one can know," she whispered urgently. "Please, Julian, promise me." He nodded, still staring at his father's improving colour. "I promise. But Evelyn—" She shook her head, cutting him off. "I need some air." She slipped out of the room just as the doctor returned, leaving Julian to handle the medical staff's surprised questions about Edward's sudden improvement. The rest of the day passed in a blur of tests and cautious optimism from the medical team. As night settled over the hospital, Julian sat in the darkness of his father's room, listening to the now steady beeping of monitors. Edward slept peacefully, his breathing normal, his colour healthy. Julian's mind whirled with the implications of what he'd witnessed. Evelyn's touch had done something medical science couldn't explain. It was a gift, a remarkable, powerful gift. But it was also dangerous. If word got out, her life would never be the same. She'd be hounded by media, subjected to endless tests, her privacy destroyed forever. He thought of how carefully she guarded her ability, how she'd trembled at the mere thought of being discovered. She'd risked exposure only because he'd begged her, because a man's life hung in the balance. The weight of that trust settled heavy on his shoulders. Running a hand over his tired face, Julian confronted the reality of his situation. His father needed help. Real, lasting help. And Evelyn might be the only one who could provide it. But asking her to do so meant putting her at risk of discovery. The thought of causing her harm, of betraying the trust she'd shown today, made his stomach churn. In the dim room, watching his father's chest rise and fall steadily, Julian felt the full weight of his dilemma. He needed Evelyn's help, but involving her further could destroy everything she'd built for herself. There were no easy answers, no clear path forward that wouldn't require sacrifice from someone. The monitors beeped steadily in the darkness, marking time as Julian sat vigil, torn between his father's needs and his growing desire to protect the remarkable woman who'd shown him what real strength looked like. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when Julian and Evelyn made their way back to the servant quarters. Dark circles shadowed both their eyes from a night spent worrying at Edward's bedside. The familiar halls of the mansion felt different now, charged with an unspoken tension after yesterday's events at the hospital. Julian cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence between them. "I want to do better," he said quietly. "Will you help me learn?" Evelyn studied him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "Are you sure that's what you want?" "Yes," he replied without hesitation. "I need structure, a routine, something to ground me." She nodded slowly. "All right, we'll start with the basics. First task, windows in the east wing. They haven't been properly cleaned in weeks." Julian followed her to a supply closet, watching as she gathered cleaning supplies. She demonstrated the proper technique. Spray, wipe in circular motions, squeegee in straight lines, then buff with a microfiber cloth. What looked simple in her capable hands proved surprisingly challenging. "You're pressing too hard," she said gently, adjusting his grip on the squeegee. Let the tool do the work. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he worked. His arms ached, unused to such sustained physical effort. But gradually the windows began to shine. Each clean pane felt like a small victory. "Not bad for a first try," Evelyn commented, inspecting his work. "Next, we'll help Mrs. Thompson with the linens." They found the elderly housekeeper in the laundry room, struggling with a heavy basket of sheets. Julian rushed forward instinctively to help, earning a surprised smile from both women. "These old hands aren't what they used to be," Mrs. Thompson said gratefully. "Thank you, dear." Under her instruction, Julian learned to fold fitted sheets, a task that proved unexpectedly complex. His first attempts were lumpy and uneven, but Mrs. Thompson's patient guidance and Evelyn's quiet encouragement kept him trying. "My mother used to help with things like this, didn't she?" he asked suddenly, smoothing a wrinkle from a pillowcase. Mrs. Thompson's eyes softened. "Indeed she did. Your mother believed in knowing how everything in the house worked, said it helped her appreciate the effort that went into making a home." The words settled heavy in Julian's chest. How far he'd strayed from her example. Mid-morning found them in the pantry, where Mr. Harwood was attempting to reorganize the shelves. His arthritis made it difficult to reach the higher spots, and he gratefully accepted Julian's offer to help. "Everything has its proper place," Mr. Harwood explained, directing Julian in arranging cans and dry goods. "A well-organized pantry makes everyone's job easier." As they worked, the elderly man shared stories about the mansion's history, including tales of Julian's grandfather that he'd never heard before. It was strange, realizing how much these people knew about his family, how much he'd never bothered to learn. After lunch, Evelyn took him into town for community errands. They visited the local food bank, where Julian helped sort donations. The gratitude in people's eyes when they received their packages struck something deep within him. This was the kind of work his mother had believed in. Direct, personal, meaningful. "Your mother used to volunteer here every Wednesday," Evelyn mentioned quietly as they loaded empty boxes into the car. "The staff still talks about her." Back at the mansion, the afternoon passed in a blur of practical tasks. Julian learned to operate the washing machine, discovered the proper way to dust delicate antiques, and helped prepare dinner alongside the kitchen staff. Each new skill came with its share of mistakes, but Evelyn's steady presence made the learning process less daunting. As evening approached, they tackled the main pantry's reorganization. Julian's arms trembled from the day's unfamiliar work, but he persisted, determined to finish what they'd started. "Thank you," he said suddenly, pausing with a bag of flour in his hands. "Not just for today, but for everything." Evelyn looked up from her inventory list, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "I mean it," he continued. "I've been—" He struggled to find the right words. "I've been blind to so much, taking people for granted, taking their work for granted. I'm starting to understand what my father was trying to show me." She nodded, accepting his words without comment, but something in her expression softened. They finished the pantry work in comfortable silence, the space between them filled with unspoken understanding. As Julian headed toward his quarters for the night, Evelyn watched him go from the kitchen doorway. His shoulders were slumped with exhaustion, his expensive clothes wrinkled and stained from honest work. But there was something different in his bearing, a hint of humility that hadn't been there before. The man who had mocked her at the gala seemed very far away from the one who had spent the day learning to fold sheets and clean windows. It was a small change, perhaps, but significant, like the first crack in a wall that had stood for far too long. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as Julian followed Evelyn through her neighborhood. Old brick buildings lined the streets, their weathered facades telling stories of generations who had called this place home. It was a far cry from the manicured estates he was used to, but there was an undeniable warmth in how neighbors called out greetings as they passed. "Mrs. Chen is first on our list," Evelyn explained, consulting her phone. "She's 83 and can't manage the stairs to the market anymore." They climbed the narrow steps to a second-floor apartment, arms laden with grocery bags. A tiny woman with silver hair answered the door, her face lighting up at the sight of Evelyn. "Oh, my dear!" Mrs. Chen exclaimed, then peered curiously at Julian. "And who is this handsome young man?" "This is Julian," Evelyn replied. "He's helping me with deliveries today." Mrs. Chen insisted they come in for tea, and Julian found himself perched on a floral print chair, surrounded by family photos and the scent of jasmine. As Evelyn helped put away the groceries, Mrs. Chen shared stories about her grandchildren, showing Julian pictures with obvious pride. "Such a blessing to have young people who care," she said, patting his hand. "Not many take time for old folks anymore." Throughout the morning, they visited 5 more seniors. Each home held its own story. Mr. Rodriguez with his collection of model trains, Miss Dorothy and her beloved cats, the Williams sisters who still baked cookies for the neighborhood children. Julian watched Evelyn interact with each person, noting how she remembered their preferences and concerns, asking about health issues and family members by name. By afternoon, they were helping Mrs. Thompson at the First Baptist Church's clothing drive. The fellowship hall buzzed with activity as volunteers sorted donations into neat piles. "Julian, dear," Mrs. Thompson called, "could you help arrange these winter coats by size? And make sure to check the pockets. People often forget things." Without hesitation, Julian dove into the task. He found himself thinking about the faces they'd seen that morning, imagining how these coats might keep someone warm in the coming winter. As he worked, he overheard Mrs. Thompson speaking quietly to Evelyn. "That young man's changed more in a week than I would have thought possible," she said. "The Lord works in mysterious ways." Later, during a quiet moment while they sorted children's shoes, Evelyn noticed Julian's hands trembling slightly. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. Julian stared at his shaking hands. Sometimes it just hits me. All the pressure, the expectations. I've gotten good at hiding it behind attitude, but—" He trailed off, looking embarrassed. Evelyn set down the shoes she was holding. "Here," she said. "Let me show you something that helps me." She demonstrated a simple breathing technique. In for 4 counts, hold for 7, out for 8. "My grandmother taught me this when I was struggling with panic attacks. It helps ground you in the present moment." Julian closed his eyes and followed her lead. The trembling in his hands gradually subsided. "I used to think showing any weakness made me less of a leader," he admitted. "But watching you these past days, there's strength in being gentle, isn't there?" Evelyn smiled softly. "The strongest people I know are often the kindest." As they finished at the church, Evelyn hesitated before asking, "We have a midweek service tonight. Would you like to come?" Julian's first instinct was to refuse. He hadn't set foot in a church since his mother's funeral. But something made him nod. "I'd like that." That evening, the church glowed with warm light as people filtered in. Julian felt conspicuous in his casual clothes, but no one seemed to notice or care. Mrs. Thompson waved them over to her usual pew, making room between herself and an elderly gentleman who introduced himself as Deacon James. The service was unlike anything Julian had experienced. There was a simplicity to it, an authenticity that touched something deep within him. The congregation sang with heartfelt joy, their voices blending in harmony. When people shared prayer requests, they spoke of real struggles, illness, job losses, family concerns, and others nodded in understanding and support. The pastor's message was about finding strength in vulnerability, about how God often works through our weaknesses. Julian felt each word resonate with his recent experiences. He glanced at Evelyn, who was listening intently, her face peaceful in the soft light. After the service, people lingered to chat, sharing coffee and homemade cookies. No one treated Julian like a wealthy outsider or seemed impressed by his family name. They simply included him in their conversations, asking his opinion on the message or offering him another cookie. Standing outside the church afterward, Julian looked up at the stars visible between the city buildings. The evening air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of approaching autumn. For the first time in years, he felt truly at peace. Not the artificial calm of control and power, but something deeper and more genuine. The church's stained glass windows glowed behind him, and distant laughter drifted from the fellowship hall where some members were still chatting. In this moment, surrounded by the evidence of simple faith and community, Julian understood something his mother had tried to teach him long ago. True peace comes not from what you possess, but from what you give. The morning sun cast long shadows through the hospital corridors as Julian and Evelyn made their way to Edward's room. Julian's footsteps echoed against the polished floors, his heart beating faster with each step. He glanced at Evelyn walking beside him, her face calm, but her hands clasped tightly together. "Remember," Julian whispered as they approached the room, "you're just here as support staff checking on things." Evelyn nodded, adjusting her simple blue dress. "Of course, Mr. Carr." They found Edward propped up in bed, looking pale but alert. Medical machines beeped steadily around him, their screens displaying numbers and patterns Julian didn't understand. The morning light streaming through the window made the white hospital walls seem less harsh. "Son," Edward said weakly, his eyes brightening. "I didn't expect you so early." Julian moved to his father's bedside, trying to hide his concern at how frail Edward looked. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been hit by a truck." Edward attempted a smile, but winced instead. "The doctors still can't figure out what's causing these nerve issues." Julian noticed Evelyn hanging back near the doorway. "Father, this is Miss Brooks from our staff. She's been helping me lately." Edward's eyes found Evelyn, and something in his expression softened. Even in his weakened state, he seemed to sense the gentle spirit that Julian had come to know. "Miss Brooks, thank you for looking after my son." "It's my pleasure, Mr. Carr," Evelyn replied softly. They spent the next hour in quiet conversation, with Edward asking about the estate, and Julian carefully describing his new daily routine, leaving out the more humbling details. But as the morning wore on, Julian noticed his father's breathing becoming more labored, his face tightening with pain. The monitors began beeping more urgently. Edward's hand clutched at his chest, his other arm rigid with tension. Julian's heart raced as he watched his father struggle. "Evelyn," he said quietly, meeting her eyes. "Please." She hesitated, her fear visible in the way she gripped the back of a nearby chair. But something in Julian's pleading expression made her step forward. "Mr. Carr," she said gently to Edward, "if you'll allow me, I'd like to try something that might help with the pain." Edward nodded weakly, beyond questioning anything that might bring relief. Evelyn moved to his bedside, opposite Julian, and slowly reached for Edward's hand. Her dark fingers wrapped gently around his pale ones. The effect was almost immediate. Edward's breathing eased, his tense muscles relaxing visibly. The monitor's urgent beeping settled into a steady rhythm. Color began returning to his face. Edward's eyes opened wider, confusion clear in his expression as he looked at their joined hands. "What? How?" "Just rest, Father," Julian said quickly, seeing Evelyn's discomfort. "Don't question it for now." But Edward's gaze remained fixed on Evelyn, something like wonder crossing his features. "You have a gift, young lady," he said softly. Evelyn carefully withdrew her hand, stepping back. "I should check on other duties," she said quietly. "Please feel better, Mr. Carr." Julian watched his father's face as Evelyn excused herself to wait in the hallway. The pain had clearly subsided, leaving Edward looking more like himself than he had in days. "Thank you," Julian said, squeezing his father's shoulder. "Get some rest. I'll be back tomorrow." In the hallway, he found Evelyn standing by a window, her arms wrapped around herself. "Thank you," he said again, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't tell you how much that means to me." The drive back to the estate was quiet at first, both lost in their thoughts as the city passed by outside. The late afternoon sun painted everything in warm, golden light. Finally, Evelyn spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared, Julian. If people find out about this—" She gestured vaguely at her hands. "I've seen how people react to things they don't understand. They'll want to study me, test me. I'll become some kind of circus attraction." Julian turned to face her, his expression serious. "I won't let that happen. I promise you, Evelyn. No one will know unless you want them to." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I have the resources to protect you," he said firmly. "And more importantly, I owe you more than I can ever repay. You've helped my father, yes, but you've also helped me see things I was blind to before." Evelyn turned back to the window, watching the streets go by. The setting sun caught in her dark eyes, and Julian could see both fear and hope reflected there. She didn't respond, but her shoulders relaxed slightly. As they approached the estate, the sky blazing orange and purple above them, Julian found himself wondering at the strange turns life could take. A week ago, he would have dismissed any talk of healing touches as nonsense. Now he had witnessed something miraculous, not just in his father's hospital room, but in his own heart as well. He glanced at Evelyn's profile against the window, seeing not the maid he had once mocked, but a woman of extraordinary strength and grace. Whatever came next, he knew with absolute certainty that he would keep his promise to protect her. The car turned through the estate gates as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky. Evelyn continued gazing out the window, her expression thoughtful but uncertain, carrying the weight of her gift and the hope of newfound trust. The kitchen buzzed with early morning activity as Julian stood at the stove, his brow furrowed in concentration. Steam rose from several pots as he stirred oatmeal carefully, just as Evelyn had taught him. The clock read 6:15 in the morning. "A little more cinnamon," he muttered to himself, reaching for the spice jar. His sleeves were rolled up, and his usually pristine appearance was slightly rumpled from his early start. Evelyn appeared in the doorway, stopping short at the sight before her. "Julian, what are you doing up so early?" He turned, a proud smile lighting up his face. "Surprise. I've invited some of the seniors from your neighborhood for breakfast. Mrs. Thompson helped spread the word." He gestured to the dining room, where tables had been arranged with fresh flowers and simple but elegant place settings. "But how did you—" Evelyn walked into the kitchen, amazed at the spread of food being prepared. "I remembered everything you showed me about cooking basics," Julian explained, stirring the oatmeal again. "And I may have called Mrs. Thompson last night for some extra tips." The sound of voices in the hallway drew their attention. Mrs. Thompson appeared, leading a small group of elderly residents from the neighborhood. Their faces showed a mix of curiosity and hesitation as they entered the grand estate's staff dining area. "Good morning, everyone," Julian called out, wiping his hands on his apron. "Please, make yourselves comfortable. Breakfast will be ready shortly." Mrs. Thompson beamed, ushering people to their seats. "See, I told you all it would be worth coming out early." Evelyn watched in amazement as Julian moved from the kitchen to the dining room, personally greeting each guest. He remembered names she had only mentioned in passing during their community errands, asking Mr. Jenkins about his garden and Mrs. Martinez about her grandchildren. The dining room slowly filled with warmth and chatter as more seniors arrived. Julian served plates of steaming oatmeal topped with fresh berries, alongside scrambled eggs and toast. His movements were careful but confident, so different from his first awkward attempts at household tasks just days ago. "This is mighty fine oatmeal," Mr. Jenkins commented, spooning up another bite. "Just like my mama used to make." Julian's face lit up. "That's Evelyn's recipe. She showed me exactly how much cinnamon to add." The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow over the gathering. Laughter echoed off the walls as stories were shared and connections made. Evelyn noticed how Julian listened intently to each person, showing genuine interest in their lives. After breakfast, as some guests began to leave, Julian announced, "I've arranged for cars to take everyone home, and there are some fresh food packages to take with you." Mrs. Thompson touched his arm gently. "You've come a long way, young man," she said softly. "Your mamma would be proud." Julian's eyes glistened slightly at her words, but he quickly busied himself with helping people to their cars. As the morning transitioned to afternoon, Julian and Evelyn found themselves at Mrs. Thompson's house. The porch railing had been loose for months, and Julian insisted on fixing it himself. "Hand me that wrench?" he asked, crouched by the railing. Sweat dampened his shirt in the afternoon heat, but he worked steadily, tightening bolts and reinforcing weak spots. Evelyn passed him tools, watching his careful attention to detail. "You're getting pretty good at this," she observed. "Well, I had a good teacher," he replied, glancing up at her with a smile. "Several good teachers, actually." They spent the next few hours delivering food packages to elderly neighbors who couldn't make it to breakfast. Julian carried heavy bags upstairs, chatted with residents, and even helped one woman program her television remote. As the sun began to set, they returned to the estate to clean up from the morning's event. The kitchen had been mostly tidied already, but chairs still needed to be put away. "I still can't believe you did all this," Evelyn said as they worked together, stacking chairs against the wall. "I wanted to show you, and everyone, that I'm learning," Julian replied, then stumbled slightly as he tried to manage too many chairs at once. Evelyn couldn't help but laugh at his awkward juggling act, and to her surprise, Julian joined in. The sound of their shared laughter filled the room, genuine and unrestrained. "I never thought I'd see the day," she said, wiping tears of mirth from her eyes, "when Julian Carr would be stacking chairs and laughing about it." "Life is full of surprises," he responded, his eyes twinkling with humor and something deeper. As darkness fell, they finished the last of the cleanup. Julian insisted on walking Evelyn to her apartment on the estate grounds, their footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path. The evening air was cool and sweet with the scent of blooming jasmine. They walked in comfortable silence, both aware of how much had changed between them in such a short time. At her door, Evelyn turned to face him. "Thank you for today," she said softly. "You made a lot of people very happy." Julian stood there, hands in his pockets, seeming reluctant to leave. The porch light cast a warm glow over them both as they lingered in that moment, neither quite ready to say good night. The morning dawned peaceful and clear, sunlight streaming through the curtains of Julian's small servant quarters. He had grown almost comfortable in the modest room, finding an unexpected peace in its simplicity. After completing his morning tasks, Julian sat in the staff kitchen drinking coffee with Evelyn, discussing plans for the day ahead. Mrs. Thompson asked if we could help organize the church donation drive next week, Evelyn mentioned, warming her hands around her mug. Before Julian could respond, his phone buzzed urgently. His face darkened as he read the message. "It's the hospital. Dad's condition has gotten worse." Evelyn immediately stood up. "I'll get the car ready." They hurried to gather their things, the peaceful morning shattered by worry. As they approached the main entrance of the estate, something seemed off. There was unusual movement beyond the gates. "What is that?" Evelyn squinted at the gathering crowd. Suddenly, dozens of camera flashes erupted as they stepped outside. A wall of photographers and reporters surged forward, pressing against the security barriers. Shouted questions filled the air. "Mr. Carr, is it true you're being manipulated by a staff member? Miss Brooks, how long have you been controlling the Carr family? What kind of hold do you have over Edward Carr?" Julian's blood ran cold as he realized what had happened. Security footage of Evelyn entering his father's hospital room must have leaked. The media had twisted it into something sinister. He instinctively moved to shield Evelyn, placing himself between her and the cameras. "Don't answer them," he said quietly. "Keep walking." The accusations grew more vicious as they made their way to the car. "Is this a scam to steal the car fortune? Are you practicing some kind of voodoo on them?" Evelyn's face had gone pale, her steps faltering. Julian could feel her trembling beside him as the cruel implications of their words sank in. The driver managed to pull up close, but even then, photographers pressed against the windows, their cameras clicking frantically. Once inside, Evelyn buried her face in her hands. "How did they find out?" she whispered. "You promised to protect me." "I didn't tell anyone," Julian insisted, his heart racing. "I would never betray your trust like that." The drive to the hospital was tense and silent. More reporters waited at the entrance, forcing them to use a back door. Edward's condition had indeed worsened. His breathing was labored, and the monitors showed irregular patterns. Throughout the day, Evelyn kept her distance from both Julian and Edward, clearly afraid to do anything that might be captured on camera or misinterpreted. The weight of public scrutiny pressed down on her like a physical force. When they finally returned to the estate that evening, things had only gotten worse. Evelyn found an official notice in her mailbox. She was being suspended from work indefinitely due to the media attention and potential disruption to the household. Walking back to her apartment, she noticed neighbors quickly turning away, hurrying inside their homes as she passed. People who had warmly greeted her just yesterday now treated her like a pariah. Julian followed her, desperate to make things right. "I'll fix this," he promised. "I'll make a public statement, clear everything up." Evelyn turned to face him, tears streaming down her face. "How? By telling them the truth? That would only make things worse." Her voice cracked with emotion. "I trusted you. I trusted that my gift would stay private, that I could help people without becoming a spectacle." "Please." Julian stepped forward. "Let me help." "Help." Evelyn's laugh was bitter. "You're the reason I'm in this mess. Your father's punishment brought me into your world, and now my life is ruined." She wiped her eyes. "I should have known better than to trust a car." They had reached her apartment door. Evelyn's hands shook as she found her keys. "Evelyn, please." Julian's voice was raw with desperation. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I care about you." She paused, her back to him. Caring isn't enough when you don't understand what it means to be vulnerable. You've never had to worry about protecting yourself from the world's judgment. She turned the key in the lock. "I don't trust you anymore, Julian. Please leave me alone." The sound of the door closing was soft but final, leaving Julian standing alone on the walkway. The weight of her words crushed him more thoroughly than any business failure or public scandal ever had. He remained there, staring at the closed door, as darkness settled around him and the last traces of daylight faded from the sky. Through the door, he could hear the muffled sound of Evelyn crying, and the knowledge that he had caused this pain, had failed to protect someone who had shown him nothing but kindness, felt like a physical wound in his chest. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to hold on to the healing she offered, he had ended up destroying the very thing that had begun to heal his soul. The servant quarters felt smaller than ever as Julian stumbled inside, closing the door behind him. He didn't bother turning on the lights. The darkness matched his mood, and somehow the shadows felt like what he deserved. He sank onto the narrow bed, the same one that had seemed like such an insult when his father first banished him here. Now the humble surroundings felt right, a physical reminder of how far he had fallen, not in status, but in the eyes of the one person whose opinion had come to matter more than he'd realized. The memory of Evelyn's tears haunted him. Her words echoed in his mind. "I don't trust you anymore." 4 simple words that cut deeper than any business rival's threats or board member's criticism ever had. His arms began to throb, the familiar nerve pain returning with a vengeance. The medication sat in his jacket pocket, but he left it there. Physical pain seemed appropriate now. Besides, it was nothing compared to the ache in his chest. Julian closed his eyes, remembering how Evelyn's touch had soothed not just his body, but something deeper, something he hadn't even known was broken. The peace he'd felt in those moments wasn't just about pain relief. It was about connection, about someone seeing past his walls and offering genuine care without agenda. "I ruined it," he whispered into the darkness. "I ruined everything." The pain intensified, spreading up his arms and across his shoulders. Julian slid from the bed to his knees, pressing his forehead against the cool metal frame. The position reminded him of watching Evelyn pray at church, her face serene with a faith he'd always dismissed as naive. But nothing felt naive about prayer now. Nothing felt naive about reaching out to something bigger than himself, when his own strength and resources had proven so inadequate. "I don't know if you're listening," Julian whispered, his voice rough. "I haven't exactly been a regular caller." He paused, struggling to find words. "But I need help. Not for me, for Evelyn. She has this gift, this beautiful ability to heal, and I let her get hurt. I let her down." Tears he'd been holding back began to fall. "I don't know how to fix this. Money can't fix it. Power can't fix it. I need guidance. I need courage to do what's right, not what's safe." The words came easier now, tumbling out in the darkness. "Please help me protect her. Show me how to make this right. I'll do anything at all. Just don't let her gift be destroyed because of my failures." Julian remained on his knees until they ached, praying with an intensity he hadn't felt since childhood, when his mother would kneel beside his bed each night. The memory of her faith, so similar to Evelyn's, brought fresh tears. Hours passed. The moon traced shadows across the small room. Eventually, Julian climbed back onto the bed, physically and emotionally exhausted. But something had shifted inside him. A clarity was emerging, like the first hints of dawn after a long night. He had spent his entire adult life hiding behind walls of money and influence, using his power to control narratives and protect himself. But that approach had failed Evelyn completely. Perhaps the answer wasn't to hide or control, but to step fully into the light. As morning broke, Julian reached for his phone. His public relations team had been sending frantic messages all night, suggesting various strategies to minimize the scandal. They wanted to discredit the leaked footage, paint Evelyn as a disgruntled employee, distance the Carr family from the whole situation. Julian's fingers hovered over the phone. The old playbook would be safe. It would protect the company, protect his image, protect everything he'd spent years building. Everything except what mattered most. He pressed the contact for his PR director, Thompson Wales. "Julian, thank God." Thompson answered immediately. "We've got 3 different statements drafted. If we move quickly, we can schedule a press conference." Julian interrupted. "For today, as soon as possible." There was a stunned silence on the other end. "A press conference?" "Sir, with all due respect, that's the absolute last thing we should do right now. We need to minimize exposure, not—" "This isn't a discussion, Thompson. Schedule it. And don't prepare any statements. I'll handle this myself." "Mr. Carr, I must strongly advise against—" "The conference happens today, or you're fired." Julian's voice was calm, but absolute. "Your choice." He ended the call and stood, looking around the small room that had become a turning point in his life. His phone immediately began buzzing with messages from his entire PR team, begging him to reconsider, warning of the potentially catastrophic consequences to his reputation and the company's stock price. Julian ignored them all. For the first time in years, he knew exactly what he needed to do. Whether it would be enough to regain Evelyn's trust, he couldn't know, but at least he would finally be worthy of it. He showered and dressed in simple clothes, no power suit, no expensive watch, none of the armor he usually wore to face the public. Today, he would stand before the world exactly as he was, a man who had failed, who had hurt someone precious, and who was finally ready to tell the truth. The PR team's messages grew increasingly desperate as the morning wore on. They knew they couldn't stop him, but they were determined to try. Julian let their concerns wash over him like background noise. Their panic about protecting his image only confirmed he was making the right choice. He stepped out of the servant quarters into the early morning light, ready to face whatever consequences would come. The pain in his arms still throbbed, but it no longer seemed important. Physical discomfort was a small price to pay for doing what was right. His phone rang again. Thompson probably making one last attempt to talk him out of it. Julian declined the call and walked toward the main house, where his driver would be waiting. The press conference would either save everything that mattered or destroy everything he'd built. For the first time in his adult life, Julian Carr was ready to risk it all. The conference room at the Carr Foundation headquarters buzzed with tension as journalists packed every available space. Camera crews jostled for position, their equipment creating a forest of tripods and lights. The air felt electric with anticipation. Julian stood quietly backstage, his heart pounding. For the first time in his career, he had no prepared statement, no careful script crafted by his PR team. Thompson Wales hovered nearby, looking physically ill with worry. "Sir, please," Thompson whispered one last time. "At least let me give you some talking points." Julian shook his head. No more scripts, no more hiding. Taking a deep breath, he stepped onto the stage. Camera shutters clicked rapidly as he approached the podium. The familiar pain shot through his arms as he gripped the edges, but he welcomed it now. It would remind him to stay honest. "Thank you all for coming," Julian began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I'm here today to tell the truth about recent events, not through carefully worded statements or legal teams, but simply as a man who needs to make things right." He paused, looking directly into the nearest camera. "I've spent my life hiding behind wealth and power, using them as shields against real connection and accountability. 2 weeks ago, at our annual charity gala, I publicly humiliated a woman named Evelyn Brooks, a member of our household staff, simply because she accidentally bumped my chair while serving water." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Julian continued, "That moment revealed everything wrong with who I'd become. My late mother dedicated her life to serving others through this foundation. She would have been ashamed of my behavior." His voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on. What you don't know is that for years, I've struggled with chronic nerve pain and emotional isolation. I've used these challenges to justify treating people poorly, especially those I deemed beneath my station. But Evelyn Brooks showed me a different way. The room had gone completely silent now. My father, in his wisdom, assigned me to work under Evelyn's supervision as punishment for my actions. It was meant to humble me, and it did. But it did something far more important. It showed me what true strength looks like. Julian's hands trembled slightly on the podium. Evelyn Brooks is one of the most compassionate, dignified people I've ever met. Despite my cruelty, she responded with patience and grace. She taught me basic life skills I'd never bothered to learn. She showed me how to serve others instead of just myself. And yes, through her genuine kindness and faith, she helped ease my physical pain in ways no medication ever has. He leaned forward, his voice growing fierce. The rumors circulating about Ms. Brooks manipulating my family are absolutely false. She is a woman of incredible integrity who has been unjustly attacked by sensational media coverage. The only manipulation involved was my own initial attempt to control the narrative and protect my image, for which I am deeply sorry. Taking another steadying breath, Julian delivered his final announcement. Effective immediately, I am stepping down from my positions as CEO of Car Industries and Chairman of the Car Foundation. I will retain only minimal board responsibilities until I have proven, through actions, not words, that I can be the kind of leader my mother would have wanted me to be. The room erupted in shocked exclamations. Reporters shot to their feet, shouting questions. Julian raised his hands for quiet. I'm not taking questions today. Instead, I ask that the media immediately cease their harassment of Ms. Brooks. She deserves privacy and respect. If you need someone to scrutinize, I'm right here. No more hiding, no more spin control. Just a man trying to become better than he was yesterday. With that, Julian stepped away from the podium and walked off stage, ignoring the chaos of shouting voices behind him. Thomson Wales looked like he might faint. Within hours, the press conference was playing on every major network. News anchors who had been critical of the mysterious Maid story just days before now praised Julian's unprecedented honesty. Social media exploded with supportive messages, many sharing their own stories of transformation through compassion. In her small apartment on the estate grounds, Evelyn sat curled on her couch, watching the broadcast with tears streaming down her face. She had expected Julian to distance himself from her, to protect his reputation at her expense. Instead, he had laid himself bare before the world. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends and family who had seen the conference. Mrs. Thompson had already called 3 times, exclaiming about Julian's bravery and how proud his mother would have been. But Evelyn barely registered any of it. She kept rewinding to watch Julian's face as he spoke about her, seeing the genuine remorse and fierce protectiveness in his eyes. This was not the same man who had humiliated her at the gala. This was someone new, someone who had found the courage to choose truth over power, vulnerability over control. Fresh tears fell as she watched him defend her character one more time. She had asked God to help Julian find his way back to the light. Now, watching him stand alone before those cameras, speaking from his heart without shields or pretense, she realized her prayers had been answered in ways she never expected. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hospital corridor as Julian made his way to his father's room. He had barely slept, his mind replaying the press conference and wondering if he had done enough to make things right. The familiar antiseptic smell and quiet beeping of monitors greeted him as he pushed open the door. Edward Carr sat propped up in bed, looking tired but alert. His complexion had improved significantly since yesterday, and he was reading the morning newspaper. When he saw Julian, a warm smile spread across his face. something Julian hadn't seen in years. "Son," Edward said, folding the paper carefully. "I saw your press conference." Julian pulled a chair closer to the bed, his stomach tightening. "Dad, Let me finish," Edward interrupted gently. "When your mother died, I worried I would never see her values live on in you. The way you've been living, it broke my heart." He reached for Julian's hand, squeezing it weakly. "But yesterday, watching you stand up there and speak your truth, I saw her in you. Your honesty, your willingness to be vulnerable. That was pure Caroline." Tears pricked at Julian's eyes. "I've made so many mistakes." "Yes," Edward agreed, "but admitting them publicly took real courage, the kind of courage your mother would have been proud of." He paused, studying his son's face. "Have you spoken to Evelyn since the press conference?" Julian shook his head, shame coloring his cheeks. "No, I'm not sure she'll even want to see me after everything that's happened." "Julian." Edward's voice grew serious. "That young woman has a gift far beyond whatever healing touch she possesses. She saw the good in you when everyone else, including me, had nearly given up. Don't let pride or fear keep you from asking her forgiveness." "But what if she doesn't? Then you'll have done the right thing anyway," Edward interrupted. "Sometimes doing what's right means risking rejection. Your mother taught me that." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the morning light growing stronger outside the window. Finally, Julian stood and squeezed his father's shoulder. "Thank you, Dad, for everything, including forcing me to work under Evelyn. It changed my life." Edward smiled. "Go on now. You have someone more important to talk to." The drive back to the estate felt different somehow. Julian noticed details he'd always ignored before: the carefully tended gardens, the maintenance staff collecting fallen leaves, the security guard who smiled and waved as he passed through the gate. These were people, not just employees. Evelyn had helped him see that. As he parked near the staff quarters, several workers were heading to lunch. Instead of averting their eyes as they usually did, they offered tentative smiles and nods. Mrs. Thompson even stopped to pat his arm. "That was quite something you did yesterday, Mr. Julian," she said warmly. "Your mama would have been proud." Julian felt his throat tighten. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. I'm trying to be better." "We can see that, child. We can see that." The walk to Evelyn's apartment seemed both too long and too short. Julian's hands were sweating as he climbed the steps to her door. He could hear soft gospel music playing inside, reminding him of the church service she'd invited him to, another kindness he hadn't properly appreciated at the time. Taking a deep breath, he knocked gently. The music stopped. Footsteps approached slowly, hesitated. Then the door opened just a few inches. Evelyn stood there, her expression guarded but not hostile. She wore simple jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. Even in casual clothes, she carried herself with quiet dignity. "Julian," she said softly, neither welcoming nor dismissing him. "Evelyn." His carefully prepared speech vanished from his mind. I'm so sorry. For everything." She didn't respond, but she didn't close the door either. Julian pressed on, his words tumbling out raw and unfiltered. "I failed to protect you. I got so caught up in trying to control everything that I didn't see the security footage leak coming. I should have been more careful, should have anticipated the media's reaction. Your privacy was violated because of me, and I will never forgive myself for that." Evelyn's expression softened slightly, but she remained silent. "I know the press conference probably seemed like too little, too late," Julian continued. "But I meant every word. You showed me kindness when I deserved nothing but contempt. You taught me humility and grace by example. Your faith and compassion didn't just ease my physical pain, they showed me a better way to live." His voice cracked slightly. "I understand if you can't trust me again, but I want you to know that I will spend every day trying to be worthy of the second chance you gave me. The man who humiliated you at that gala, he doesn't exist anymore. You helped me find my way back to who I was meant to be." Tears glistened in Evelyn's eyes now. She opened the door a little wider, studying his face as if searching for any trace of insincerity. "I was so afraid," she whispered, "when those reporters started shouting those awful things, calling me a fraud, a gold digger. I thought everything I'd worked for was over." "I know," Julian said softly. "And I should have done more to prevent that. But I promise you, your reputation has been restored. The media has completely shifted their coverage. People are sharing stories about how your example inspired them to be more compassionate in their own lives." A tear slipped down Evelyn's cheek. "I never wanted attention or fame. I just wanted to serve God by helping others." "I know that now, and that's exactly what I told the world." Julian took a shaky breath. "Evelyn, could we talk? Really talk? I understand if you say no, but—" She wiped her eyes and opened the door fully. "Come in, Julian. I think we both have more to say." The simple gesture of invitation felt monumental. As Julian stepped into her modest but warmly decorated apartment, he sent up a silent prayer of gratitude. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in his life, he was ready to face whatever came with humility and grace. Lessons learned from the remarkable woman who had changed his heart. Inside Evelyn's apartment, sunlight filtered through sheer curtains, casting a gentle glow across her modest living room. A well-worn Bible sat on the coffee table next to a family photo showing 3 generations of smiling women. Julian settled onto the edge of her floral print couch, while Evelyn took the armchair across from him. For a moment they sat in silence, the weight of unspoken, words filling the space between them. The distant chime of the estate's clock tower marked the passing minutes. "I've been so afraid," Julian finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just of the pain or the press, but of being seen. Really seen." He ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "When you touched my arm that first time in the laundry room, it wasn't just the physical relief that scared me. It was how exposed I felt." Evelyn nodded slowly, understanding in her eyes. "Vulnerability can feel like danger when you've spent so long building walls." "Exactly." Julian leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "And then when those reporters surrounded us, all I could think was that I'd failed to protect you, that my weakness had put you at risk." "Julian," Evelyn said softly, "you can't control everything. None of us can." When the cameras came at us, she paused, gathering her thoughts. "It brought back memories I thought I'd buried. Years ago, after the incident I told you about, reporters camped outside our house for weeks. My grandmother had to sneak me out through neighbors' yards just to get to school." Her hands twisted in her lap. "When it happened again, I just broke." Julian's heart ached at the pain in her voice. "I'm so sorry, Evelyn. I should have done more to prevent that." "Maybe we both needed to face our fears," she said thoughtfully. "These past weeks, they've changed things, haven't they?" A small smile tugged at Julian's lips as memories surfaced. "Remember when I tried to iron those tablecloths?" Evelyn's laugh was like music. "You nearly set off the smoke alarm, but you kept trying. Because you didn't give up on me." Julian's voice grew serious. "Even when I made a mess of everything, you showed patience, kindness. You were learning," Evelyn said simply. "We all need grace while we're learning." Julian thought back to their morning routines, the quiet conversations over breakfast prep, the way she'd taught him to really see the elderly staff members as people with rich lives and stories. You helped me remember who I used to be, before the pain and pride took over. Evelyn rose from her chair and moved to sit beside him on the couch. Without hesitation, she placed her hand gently on his forearm. The familiar warmth spread through him immediately, melting away the constant ache he'd lived with for so long. But this time, Julian didn't stare in amazement or question the phenomenon. Instead, he carefully covered her hand with his own, a gesture of gratitude rather than desperation. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Not just for this, but for everything." They sat together as afternoon light faded to dusk, sharing stories of the past weeks, Julian's first attempt at making biscuits for the staff breakfast, Evelyn teaching him her grandmother's method for folding fitted sheets, the evening they spent helping Mrs. Thompson organize decades of church choir photos. "Would you walk with me?" Evelyn asked, suddenly. "There's somewhere I'd like to show you." They stepped out into the cool evening air, following a familiar path toward the estate's small chapel. The stone building stood peaceful in the gathering darkness, its stained glass windows glowing softly from within. "My grandmother used to come here every morning to pray," Evelyn explained as they entered. "She worked in the main house for 40 years, raised my mother here on the estate. She always said this chapel was where she found her strength. The chapel's interior was simple but beautiful, with wooden pews worn smooth by generations of use. A rack of prayer candles flickered near the altar, some lit, others waiting. Evelyn picked up a long matchstick and turned to Julian. "My grandmother taught me that lighting a candle is like setting your hope free into the world. Would you join me?" Together they touched their match to a fresh candle's wick. The flame caught and grew steady, adding its light to the others. In that moment, as the gentle glow illuminated their faces, Julian felt a peace he hadn't known in years. Whatever came next, they would face it with renewed faith and understanding. Standing in the sacred quiet of the chapel, watching their shared light burn bright against the darkness, Julian and Evelyn found themselves exactly where they needed to be. On holy ground, surrounded by generations of prayers, hope rekindled and trust restored. The morning dawned bright and clear, perfect for a garden gathering. Sunlight sparkled on the dew-kissed roses and carefully tended flower beds of the Carr Mansion's extensive gardens. Staff members bustled about, setting up white folding chairs in neat rows on the emerald lawn, while caterers arranged elegant refreshment tables under striped awnings. Julian stood at his bedroom window, adjusting his tie and watching the preparations below. For the first time in years, his hands were steady and pain-free as he dressed. He smiled, thinking of how different everything was from that first night when his father had banished him to the servant quarters. What had seemed like punishment had become the greatest blessing of his life. Down in her apartment, Evelyn smoothed her simple blue dress, her heart racing with nervous energy. She had no idea what Julian had planned. He'd only asked her to attend a special announcement in the garden. Through her window, she could see neighbors and church members arriving, greeting each other warmly as they found their seats. At precisely 10 o'clock, a medical transport van pulled up to the garden entrance. 2 nurses helped Edward Carr into a wheelchair, his movements slow but determined. Though still recovering, his eyes were bright and alert as Julian approached to welcome him. "Good morning, son," Edward said, gripping Julian's hand firmly. "Quite a turnout you've arranged." Julian squeezed his father's shoulder. "Wait until you hear why." As the gathering grew, familiar faces filled the seats. Mrs. Thompson from the church, Mr. Harwood and other long-time staff members, seniors from the neighborhood whom Julian had helped with deliveries, and even some of the kitchen staff who'd taught him to cook those first simple meals. The atmosphere hummed with anticipation and warmth. Evelyn made her way through the crowd, stopping to hug Mrs. Thompson and exchange greetings with others. She noticed Julian standing near a small podium that had been set up beneath the garden's magnificent old magnolia trees. Their branches spread wide overhead, heavy with fresh spring blooms that filled the air with sweet fragrance. Julian caught her eye and smiled, gesturing for her to join him near the front. As she walked toward him, memories of their journey flashed through her mind. His initial cruelty at the gala, those first awkward days of him learning to serve others, the growing trust between them, and finally the profound connection they'd found in facing their fears together. When everyone was seated, Julian stepped up to the podium. The morning sun caught his face, and Evelyn could see how much he'd changed. Gone was the hard mask of pride, replaced by genuine warmth and humility. "Thank you all for coming today," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the garden. "Many of you witnessed my lowest moment a few weeks ago, when I publicly humiliated someone who would teach me more about dignity and grace than I ever thought possible." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people nodded, remembering the incident at the gala. Julian continued, "That night, my father gave me what seemed like a harsh sentence, to live and work under the supervision of the very person I had wronged. What I didn't know was that he was giving me the greatest gift of my life." Edward smiled from his wheelchair, tears glistening in his eyes as Julian went on. "Through Evelyn Brooks' patient guidance, I learned what true strength looks like. It's not found in wealth or power or position. It's found in serving others, in humility, in faith, and in the courage to be vulnerable." Julian turned to look directly at Evelyn, his voice softening. "Evelyn showed me that healing comes in many forms. Sometimes it's a gentle touch, sometimes it's a hard truth spoken with love, and sometimes it's simply the presence of someone who believes in your capacity to change." Taking a deep breath, Julian straightened his shoulders and made his announcement. "Today, I'm honored to announce the creation of the Brooks Foundation for Trauma Recovery. This organization, named after Evelyn and funded entirely by the Carr family, will provide support and healing spaces for people working through trauma and emotional wounds." A wave of applause burst from the crowd. Mrs. Thompson wiped tears from her eyes as Julian continued. "And I can think of no one better qualified to lead this foundation than the woman who taught me about healing through her own example. Evelyn, would you please join me?" Evelyn's hands trembled as she rose and walked to the podium. The applause grew stronger, filled with genuine love and support from people who had watched her quiet strength in action over the years. "As director of the Brooks Foundation," Julian said, taking her hand, "you'll have the resources and platform to help countless others find the peace and healing you found. Your grandmother's legacy of faith and service will live on through this work." Overcome with emotion, Evelyn stepped to the microphone. "I'm deeply humbled by this honor," she said softly. "My grandmother always taught me that our greatest purpose is to be a blessing to others. If my story and my experiences can help even one person find hope and healing, then every difficult moment will have been worth it." After the formal announcement, guests mingled in the garden, enjoying refreshments and congratulating Evelyn. Edward insisted on wheeling himself over to speak with her personally. "My dear," he said, taking her hand, "I knew the moment I met you in that hospital room that you were special. Thank you for helping both my son and me find our way back to what matters most." As the crowd began to disperse, Julian and Evelyn slipped away down one of the quiet garden paths. Walking hand in hand, they paused to admire the magnificent magnolia trees in full bloom above them. "I never thought being sent to work in the servant quarters would lead to this," Julian said quietly. "Your touch didn't just ease my physical pain, Evelyn. It changed the entire course of my life." Evelyn's smile was radiant as she squeezed his hand. "God works in mysterious ways," she said. "Sometimes our greatest challenges become our greatest blessings." They stood together under the canopy of magnolia blossoms, surrounded by the beauty of new life and renewal. The morning sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled patterns on the path before them. In that moment, both felt the profound rightness of where their journey had led, to a future built on compassion, strengthened by faith, and illuminated by love. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the staff kitchen as Julian and Evelyn shared breakfast at the worn wooden table. The atmosphere was noticeably different now. Gone was the awkward tension of those first difficult days. Instead, the kitchen staff moved about with easy smiles, offering Evelyn warm greetings tinged with newfound respect. Mrs. Thompson placed a fresh pot of coffee between them, patting Evelyn's shoulder affectionately. "Ready for your first real day at the helm, dear?" Evelyn's eyes sparkled with quiet joy. "As ready as I'll ever be, Mrs. Thompson, though I admit it still feels a bit surreal." Julian watched her over his coffee cup, marveling at how naturally she carried her new role. Just weeks ago, he would have scoffed at sharing breakfast in the staff kitchen. Now it felt like the most genuine part of his day. After finishing their simple meal of oatmeal and fresh fruit, they walked together through the estate grounds toward the newly renovated East Wing. The morning air was crisp, carrying the sweet scent of magnolia blossoms. "The contractors did an amazing job," Evelyn remarked as they approached the building. The former storage wing had been transformed into a welcoming space with large windows and warm, natural lighting. "It feels peaceful, exactly what we want people to feel when they come here for help." Inside, the walls were painted in soft, calming colors. Comfortable seating areas invited conversation, while private consultation rooms provided safe spaces for counseling. Julian had insisted on every detail meeting Evelyn's vision, down to the artwork featuring scenes of hope and healing. They settled into what would be their shared office, reviewing the day's schedule. "The first volunteer orientation starts at 10 o'clock, Evelyn said, spreading out her carefully prepared notes. "We have 15 people coming, mostly from my church and the neighborhood." Julian smiled at her thorough preparation. "You've thought of everything." "I want them to understand that this isn't just about offering services," she explained, her voice gentle but passionate. "It's about creating a sanctuary where people can feel safe enough to begin healing." Throughout the morning, Julian watched in quiet amazement as Evelyn led the orientation session. She shared her own journey through trauma with remarkable openness, explaining how faith and community support had helped her find peace. The volunteers hung on every word, many wiping away tears as she described her vision for the foundation. "Each person who comes through these doors will carry their own unique pain," she told them. "Our job is not to fix them, but to walk alongside them with patience and understanding." During the afternoon, Evelyn met with each volunteer individually, listening to their stories and helping them find their perfect roles within the foundation. Julian observed how she drew out their strengths with the same gentle persistence she had shown him. As the day drew to a close, they drove to the hospital to visit Edward. They found him sitting up in bed, looking stronger than he had in weeks. His eyes twinkled mischievously as they entered. "Well, if it isn't my favorite pair of lovebirds," he teased, prompting shy smiles from both of them. "Dad," Julian protested, but couldn't hide his grin. "Oh, let an old man have his fun." Edward chuckled. "Love suits you both. Anyone can see that." Evelyn ducked her head, blushing, while Julian squeezed her hand. They spent an hour sharing updates about the foundation's progress, Edward offering occasional advice from his years of experience in charitable work. As evening settled over the estate, Julian and Evelyn took their usual walk through the gardens. Lanterns cast a warm glow along the paths, creating pools of golden light among the shadows. The air was sweet with the scent of night-blooming jasmine. When they reached the magnificent magnolia tree, their tree as they'd come to think of it, Julian stopped and turned to face Evelyn. Taking both her hands in his, he looked into her eyes with profound sincerity. "Everything good in my life now grew from the lessons you taught me," he said softly. "I promise you, Evelyn, I will build a life worthy of your trust, a life rooted in humility, kindness, and the faith you helped me rediscover." Evelyn's eyes shimmered with tears as she leaned into him. Above them, magnolia blossoms drifted down like nature's blessing, settling softly around their feet. In that moment, surrounded by the beauty of new beginnings, they stood together in perfect peace, ready to step into whatever tomorrow might bring. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.